Commodore is back, and their first order of business was re-releasing their classic bestseller, the Commodore 64. This is the Commodore 64 Ultimate. It may look like a C64 on the outside, but something tells me that we might just find some newer technology under the hood. So today we're going to pop it open and take a look at how it works. Let's face it, we're living in interesting times right now. I never imagined that I would see the resurrection of Commodore. But here we are, and not only is Commodore back, but they have an all-new re-release of their beloved Commodore 64 called the Commodore 64 Ultimate. Like many others, when I saw this system announced, I jumped right on board and ordered one. Even though there were a couple of different versions to choose from, I had to stick with the classic and go with the standard beige. Now, this isn't the first time that there's been a modern recreation of the Commodore 64. The C64 Mini came out back in 2018, but under its hood was an ARM CPU running the Vice emulator. While you could connect a USB keyboard to it, the Mini itself was small, and the built-in keyboard was just cosmetic, so it didn't really intend to be a full relaunch of the C64. Alongside that, there's also a project called the Ultimate 64. That's a fan-made FPGA-based C64 mainboard replacement created by a Dutch engineer named Gideon Zwitser. Gideon's been working on Commodore 64 hardware projects since 2008 when his first product became available, the 1541 Ultimate. He actually demonstrated a full C64 implementation in an FPGA back in 2011, and the Ultimate 64 eventually grew out of that work. And you may not realize it, but Commodore licensed Gideon's design to create the Commodore 64 Ultimate. So what we have here is essentially the culmination of over a decade of one engineer's work on recreating the C64 in an FPGA, now packaged as a real Commodore product. The C64 Ultimate not only looks almost exactly like an original C64, but it functions just like one as well, except with a few modern conveniences. In fact, when you put it next to an original C64, you can't really tell much of a difference. The enclosure, badging, and the keyboard are all close replicas. But the one main giveaway is the ports on the side and the back. In the back left, you'll normally find the user port, but on the Commodore 64 Ultimate there is instead two USB ports, an Ethernet port, and HDMI output. Next to that is the cassette interface, and this brings up one of the more interesting aspects of this device. It can use original Commodore peripherals. Here you can connect a Commodore dataset drive and load up the content from your old cassette tapes. Next to that is the serial port, which accepts Commodore IEC devices such as this 1541 disk drive. And as you can see, it just works out of the box. For analog video, there's an 8-pin Commodore AV port. Just like an original C64, this port outputs a luma and chroma signal along with composite video and audio. But unlike the original C64, it also supports RGB output. You can switch the port over to RGB mode, and this allows you to connect it natively to a monitor that accepts an RGB signal. You do, however, need a special cable for that, since the pin assignments are different than a standard C64 AV cable. There's an additional audio output port next to it, where the RF connector would normally be in an original C64. This port can use a 3.5mm audio cable, but it also supports a mini Toastlink cable for optical audio. And on the far end of the back, there's a cartridge port. This seems to work fine with most of the games that I've tried. I did, however, notice that it doesn't work with my Kung Fu Flash cartridge, though it does seem to work fine with the Teensy ROM. On the right side of the device, we have a barrel connector for a 12-volt power supply, a rocker switch, and 2 joystick ports that are compatible with original C64 joysticks. Now, the rocker switch has been under a lot of scrutiny, and rightfully so. I've been using it for a few weeks, and it's just awful. It's neat that it looks like an original Commodore power switch, but it's very stiff and awkward to use. This is all very interesting, but I know what you're really here for. So let's go ahead and tear this device down. Now, one thing I really like is how easy it is to get inside. We just need to remove the 3 Phillips head screws from underneath. And as I'm lifting the lid, you can see that the keyboard is connected with a USB cable, which I didn't quite expect. It also looks like we need to disconnect the power LED from these header pins. With the top removed, I think it's pretty clear that they expect you to catch a glimpse of the mainboard. In the lower right, we have signatures of the folks who worked on this system. To get a full view of the mainboard, we'll go ahead and take out the 10 additional Phillips screws that fasten it to the case. And on the underside, there are several more names laid out in the shape of the Commodore logo. That's neat, but the thing that really surprised me is that I recognize one of these names. This is Dave Ziembicki, Jr.
So hi, I'm Dave Ziembicki Jr., and then my father is here, who is one of the original engineers on the Commodore 64 project.
And I'm Dave Ziembicki Sr. Again, was lucky enough to be at Commodore at the time that the project came up, and it was an interesting time back then.
Dave Jr. and I actually worked together for a number of years on the same team at Microsoft. In fact, I was one of the interviewers that grilled Dave when he went through the interview process many years ago. I actually didn't know that Dave's father was one of the original engineers on the C64. That was something that I discovered as I was making this video. I was able to sit down and spend some time with Dave Sr. to hear more about his time at Commodore.
And again, what they did is they pulled a handful of us in, just before Thanksgiving and said, this is what we want to do. And it wasn't just the C64 that we worked on. They wanted the 64, they wanted an education targeted unit, and then they wanted a game machine. So we actually did 3 different prototypes at the same time, 64 being the main one that they wanted to push.
And towards the end, I was joined by some special guests who had a couple of surprises for Dave.
As thanks, obviously, for all your work with Commodore and making this machine and other ones. We'd love to send you a Founders Edition as soon as we get some in stock. This is the gold one with 24 karat gold badge there and PVD keycaps and all of that stuff. So maybe we can get your details from Ken and get you one of those.
I'd appreciate that. It's good that it's being remembered. It's good that it's still being promoted. I think it was important at the time, and it sounds like you're going to really drive it forward, which is excellent.
I'll be releasing my full interview with Dave Ziembicki next week, but if you want to watch it before then, I've made it available to my paid members on Patreon. So head on over there and please consider supporting the work I do in these videos by becoming a member. The link is in this video's description. Okay, let's take a closer look at the main board. As I mentioned earlier, this board is an evolution of Gideon's C64 mainboard replacement, the Ultimate 64 Elite 2. If you look at them side by side, you can clearly see the similarities. I want to start with this daughter board that's labeled as the FPGA board. Now, this is a really interesting design. The FPGA, along with a few supporting devices, are all on this removable expansion board. And when I take it out, you can see that it has a standard DDR4 SODIMM connector. Taking a closer look, the chip-labeled CPU is a Xilinx Arctic 7 FPGA. This particular FPGA has 52,000 logic cells, which is more than enough for emulating a Commodore 64. Now, this FPGA is not an SoC, so there's no hard CPU built into it. Keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Next to it, we have a RAM chip. This is 128 megabytes of DDR2 memory made by Micron. Also nearby is a Nuvoton NAU88C22, which is labeled as audio. This is a 24-bit audio codec chip, which can function as both an ADC and a DAC. It includes a built-in amplifier and can also perform some digital signal processing. There are also two different video chips on board. One's labeled digital video, and that's an NXP chip called the PTN3363. This is an HDMI level shifter and redriver. So this means that the FPGA is putting out a digital video signal, and this chip will ensure that it meets HDMI specifications at the port. I did notice that this chip is end of life, and there doesn't seem to be any in stock anywhere, so after Commodore runs out, I expect that it would be replaced with perhaps a PTN3361. The other video chip is labeled analog video, and this is a Texas Instruments THS8136. This is a digital to analog converter for the video signal. The chip will take 30 bits of red, green, and blue pixel data and convert it to an analog signal. So this chip must be what's feeding the video portion of the analog AV port in the rear. There's also a chip on the FPGA board labeled paddle, and as you can probably guess, its purpose is to support paddle controllers. Now on an original Commodore 64, there are analog pins on this SID chip that are used for the paddles. But the C64 Ultimate has the SID implemented in the FPGA, and the Arctic 7 doesn't have any analog inputs. So this LM2901 can be used to generate a digital signal from the potentiometer inside the paddle controllers. Alongside these chips, there are also a few that aren't labeled. This chip below the HDMI level shifter is an Ethernet transceiver with part number KSZ8081. This translates the Ethernet data from the FPGA into the signaling that's expected at the Ethernet port and vice versa. You'll also find two USB controller chips. First, there's a USB 2514, which is a USB 2.0 hub controller with one upstream USB port and 4 downstream ports. Now, 2 of these ports are obviously in the rear of the device here. And if you look at the main board, there's another USB dual port header right here. However, I found that only the top port is connected to the USB hub. Along with the hub controller, there's also a USB 3315 transceiver. This is the chip that interfaces the FPGA with the USB hub controller. So when you plug your USB drive into the C64 Ultimate, it talks with the 2514 over one of its downstream USB ports, which then talks to the 3315 over its upstream port, and the 3315 talks directly to the FPGA. Now, I do want to point out that this USB-C port for the keyboard isn't connected to the USB hub. In fact, despite using a USB-C connector, the keyboard isn't even a USB device. Rather, the keyboard borrows from a different fan-made project called the Blingboard 64. The Blingboard uses its own serial protocol, so it's not using any USB signaling. And alongside the USB-C connector, there's actually a separate header on the PCB that accepts an original Commodore 64 keyboard. So if you have an original keyboard and prefer it over the Blingboard, you can swap it out for a more authentic typing experience. The last chip that I'll point out here on the FPGA board is this WinBond flash chip. The model number is W25Q128, so it's a 128 megabit chip, providing 16 megabytes of flash storage. Now, what's interesting is that you can store your own files on this chip using the built-in file browser. But if you look at the system information dialog, it says there's only 11 megabytes free. Now, there are a few files on here already, but they take up less than 300 kilobytes. So what's using the rest of this chip's storage? To find out, I wired up the flash to my TL866 and dumped its contents. And here's what I found. The flash chip is split into 4 segments. The first 2.1 megabytes stores the FPGA's bitstream. And this confirms something that I already expected about this system's design. When the system powers on, the FPGA will bootstrap itself by using SPI to read the bitstream directly from the flash chip. The next 1.9 megabytes contains the application firmware. As I mentioned earlier, the Arctic 7 FPGA doesn't have a hard processor built in, and you'll notice that there's no CPU on this module. So instead of a hard CPU, the bitstream contains a soft RISC-V CPU running free RTOS at 100 MHz. The RISC-V handles the higher level logic such as the menu system, file management, and networking, and this is all directed by the application firmware. The third segment in the flash chip is the actual storage device that's presented to the system. In total, it provides a little under 12 megabytes of storage, which acts like a flash drive. And finally, there's 96 kilobytes at the end of this chip, which are dedicated to storing configuration settings. When you choose the option to write a setting to flash, this is where that data is kept. Okay, let's set the FPGA module aside and take a look at the larger white PCB. Even though most of the system's capabilities are happening in the FPGA board, there is still quite a bit going on here as well. First, looking at the upper right, you'll see that the ports are broken out from the FPGA connector. Aside from a few passives, there aren't really any ICs that are actively doing anything here, since all the processing is done on the FPGA board. But moving down the board, you'll notice what may be a familiar sight: an ESP32S3 microcontroller labeled Wi-Fi on the silkscreen. Now, an ESP32 can do much more than just serve up Wi-Fi, but I'm not sure if this is really doing anything else. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's likely that the FPGA is using master SPI mode to read the bitstream straight from the flash chip, so it's not bootstrapping the FPGA. Beneath this MCU, you'll find a USB-C port, which is labeled ESP32. This looks to be a programming and debug port for the microcontroller's firmware. Now, there are also a couple of pin headers down here, one labeled for keyboard LEDs and the other for case LEDs. There is a Starlight edition of the C64 Ultimate, which includes a clear case lined with LEDs, as well as LEDs in the keyboard, so this must be where those connect. Near the SODIMM socket, there are also a few additional headers. There's a row of 4 pins labeled console, and this looks to be a serial connector. And next to that is another header labeled buttons with pins labeled right, middle, and left. These aren't connected to anything out of the box, but if you were to connect a momentary switch to these pins, they act as 3 additional alternative buttons that you can use in place of that rocker switch. There's also a 10-pin header nearby, which can be used for a JTAG programmer. Oddly enough, these pins are laid out in a configuration compatible with a USB blaster, which is the standard JTAG programmer for Altera or Intel FPGAs. It turns out that the early revisions of this design did actually use a Cyclone 5. So it looks like the Altera JTAG header was just left in place after the more recent designs moved to a Xilinx chip. Now, there's something else on this board that I haven't talked about yet, and it's one of the more exciting features for Commodore 64 audiophiles. On the right side of the PCB, you'll find 2 ZIF sockets. These are for installing real SID chips. Out of the box, these sockets aren't populated. The C64 Ultimate already has SID emulation running in the FPGA, and it's actually pretty good. But for the purists out there, nothing beats the real thing. These ZIF sockets support both the original 6581 SID chip as well as the later 8580. These chips actually operate off of different voltages. The 6581 requires 12 volts while the 8580 uses 9 volts. But that's not an issue with this board because you can drop in either chip and it automatically detects which SID you've installed and adjusts the voltage accordingly. Now, looking at the traces coming off these SID sockets, you can see they're connected to the FPGA through a pair of bus transceivers. These are Nexperia 16-bit transceivers which buffer the signal between the chips and act as level shifters to protect the FPGA. If you're using HDMI audio, then the audio from both SID chips gets digitized and merged into the HDMI audio stream. But if you look next to the analog audio jack, you'll notice some jumpered headers. By default, these are set to mix, which means that the source of the analog audio is the integrated mixer. But if you switch these jumpers over to SID, that connects the output of the SID chips directly to the audio jack. You'll also notice that there's a speaker mounted directly to the PCB. In its default state, the system uses this speaker for emulating floppy disk sounds. This is an interesting feature, but I have to admit that after a while, it grew to be quite annoying, so I ended up turning mine off in the settings menu. But the speaker can also be used for playing regular system audio as well. From the audio mixer menu, you can choose which audio sources to mix into the speaker's output, along with the volume of each source. The audio isn't great, but it works in a pinch if you don't have any other speakers. Above the speaker, we have the cartridge port. Its data bus and lower address lines are routed through the same bus transceivers used by the SID sockets. But the remaining cartridge port signals use a 7400 series logic chip by Texas Instruments called the 3861. This is a separate 10-bit bus switch that level shifts the signals before making their way over to the FPGA. Overall, I think the Commodore 64 Ultimate is a really well-designed machine. And that shouldn't be a surprise, especially given that it was pieced together from multiple community projects that have been around for a while. In particular, the FPGA daughter board is a clever design choice. By putting the core computing hardware on a removable SODIMM module, Gideon has opened the door for other Commodore 64 form factors. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw this daughter board used in future Commodore products. And the Arctic 7 has plenty of room to grow beyond just the Commodore 64. There's really no reason why this FPGA couldn't run other system cores like a VIC-20 or a Commodore 128, or even something completely different. The system isn't without its flaws, but overall, I'm impressed. This is a great first product by the relaunched Commodore Corporation, and I think it gives us a good sense of what we might expect in the future. Alright, that's all I have for today, so I'll see you next time. But, as always, until then, go make something cool.